Amistad, Spanish for friendship, was a 19th century two-masted schooner built in the United States citation needed, but owned by a Spaniard living in Cuba. It became renowned in July 1839 as the site of a slave revolt by men captives, who had been enslaved in Sierra Leone, and were being transported for sale between Havana, Cuba, and other Caribbean islands. The African captives took control of the ship in July 1839, killing some of the crew and ordering the survivors to sail the ship to Africa. The Spanish survivors secretly maneuvered the ship north, and Amistad was captured off the coast of Long Island by the brig USS Washington. The men and Amistad were interned in Connecticut while federal court proceedings were undertaken for their disposition. The owners of the ship and Spanish government claimed the slaves as property, but the U.S. had banned the African trade and argued that the men were legally free. Because of issues of ownership and jurisdiction, the case gained international attention. Known as United States v. The Amistad, 1841, the case was finally decided by the Supreme Court of the United States in favor of the men, restoring their freedom. It became a symbol in the United States in the movement to abolish slavery. The ship, Amistad, was a 19th century two-masted schooner of about 120 feet, 37 meters. Built in the United States, Amistad was originally named Friendship. It was renamed in Spanish after being purchased by a Spaniard. Strictly speaking, Amistad was not a slave ship. It was not designed to transport large cargoes of slaves, nor did it engage in the middle passage of Africans to the Americas. The crew of Amistad, lacking purpose-built slave quarters, placed half the captives in the main hold, and the other half on deck. The captives were relatively free to move about, which aided their revolt and commandeering of the vessel. Amistad engaged in the shorter, coastwise trade around Cuba and in the Caribbean. The primary cargo carried by Amistad was sugar industry products, and its normal route ran from Havana to its home port of Guanaja, on an island off Honduras. The ship also carried a limited number of passengers and, on occasion, slaves being transported for delivery or sale. The men captives who revolted while aboard Amistad had been illegally transported from Africa to Havana aboard the larger slave ship Takara. 1839 Slave Revolt. In 1839 Amistad left Havana for Puerto Príncipe, Cuba, a smaller port near the sugar plantation where the slaves were to be delivered. The ship carried 53 men captives, 49 adults and 4 children, who had been captured from Sierra Leone to be sold into slavery in Cuba. On July 2, Singh BP, later known in the United States as Joseph Sink, led the captives in a revolt against the mostly Spanish crew on the ship. The men had been transported to Havana aboard the slave ship Takara. These captives were being taken along the coast to a smaller port closer to a sugar plantation. In the main hold below decks, the captives found a rusty filing sawed through their manacles. Once free, the men quickly went up on deck and, armed with machete-like cane knives, attacked the crew, successfully gaining control of the ship. They killed the captain and some of the crew, but spared the navigator so he could guide them back to Africa. While they demanded to be returned home, the navigator Don Pedro Montez deceived the men about the course, maneuvering the ship north along the North American coast. They reached the eastern tip of Long Island, New York. Discovered by the revenue cutter USRC Washington, Amistad was taken into United States custody. The men were interned at New Haven, Connecticut, while the courts settled their legal status and conflicting international claims regarding Amistad's ownership, as well as the status of its property, including the slaves. Court case. A widely publicized court case ensued in New Haven to settle legal issues about the ship and the status of the men captives. They were at risk of execution if convicted of mutiny. This became a cause célèbre among abolitionists in the United States. Since 1808, the United States and Britain had prohibited the international slave trade. The ship's owners fraudulently described the men as having been born in Cuba and said they were being sold in the Spanish domestic slave trade, in order to avoid the international prohibition on the African slave trade. The court had to determine if the men were to be considered salvage and thus the property of naval officers who had taken custody of the ship, as was legal in such cases, the property of the Cuban buyers, or the property of Spain, as Queen Isabella II claimed, via Spanish ownership of the Amistad. A question was whether the circumstances of the Mendes' capture and transportation meant they were free and had acted as free men rather than slaves. On appeal, the United States v. The Amistad Case reached the U.S. Supreme Court. In 1841, it ruled that the men had been illegally transported and held as slaves, and had rebelled in self-defense. It ordered them freed. 35 survivors returned to Africa in 1842, aided by funds raised by the United Missionary Society, a black group founded by James W. C. Pennington, a Congregational minister and fugitive slave in Brooklyn, New York, who was active in the abolitionist movement. Later years, after being moored at the wharf behind the U.S. Custom House in New London, Connecticut, for a year and a half, Amistad was auctioned off by the U.S. Marshal in October 1840. Captain George Halford, of Newport, Rhode Island, purchased the vessel and then needed an act of Congress passed to register it. Citation needed, he renamed it Ion. In late 1841, he sailed Ion to Bermuda and St. Thomas with a typical New England cargo of onions, apples, live poultry, and cheese. After sailing Ion for a few years, Halford sold it in Guadeloupe in 1844. There is no record of what became of Ion under the new French owners in the Caribbean.